every software engineer is trying to figure out how their job works, and we're trying to solve problems for those software engineers. So as a leader, it's much more difficult to lean on all of my context and experience. And I have to build fresh new context and experience, sort of one step ahead or a few steps behind the people on my team, trying to be there with them, figuring this out.
I'm Rebecca Murphy, and this is Engineering Unblocked. Engineering Unblocked is brought to you by Swarmia, the engineering intelligence platform that's trusted by some of the best software companies in the world, including startups like Superhuman, scale-ups like Miro, and companies from the Fortune 500. On today's show, I'm talking to Rob Zuber, CTO at CircleCI. Rob, welcome. You are the CTO at CircleCI and have been for some time, which is not always typical in the industry. So tell me a little bit. We're recording this in the end of 2025. What does it mean to be a CTO at CircleCI in 2025?
Oh my goodness. Well, as you said, it's been a while, so I could tell you the answer for many, many years, over a decade, in fact. I'd say being a CTO in 2025 is not specific to CircleCI, but rather it's a challenge everywhere. So many things are changing so quickly in terms of our perspective of what product can be, what we're building, how we're building technology, in a way that I think has forced a lot of folks. I can speak for myself, but I also talk to lots of people, and so I generally get support for the statement to be more involved technically, right? Like, and particularly in developer tools. For a long time, I was able personally to live off of my understanding of how developers worked, right? Having been a software engineer, et cetera. It's like, look, I know what everyone's trying to do. We're trying to do this. Let's go build it. Here's some ideas. I'll get out of your way. And now it's much more exploratory. Like, every software engineer is trying to figure out how their job works, and we're trying to solve problems for those software engineers. So as a leader, it's much more difficult to lean on all of my context and experience. And I have to build fresh new context and experience, sort of one step ahead or a few steps behind the people on my team, trying to be there with them, figuring this out. And so I'd say one big thing in 2025, and I think this is true from a lot of folks that I've spoken to anyway, is just a lot more involvement in the day-to-day, in the process, because it's so much more exploratory and a lot less, oh yeah, we made a plan at the beginning of the year and we just kind of execute on that plan for a year sort of thing.
That resonates a ton, because I too, and we also build dev tools at Swarmia, and same. Like, we have a bunch of super experienced software engineers who, that experience they have is valuable. I'm not discounting it, but it's not enough anymore because the landscape is changing so quickly. So, like I said, CircleCI does go back a long time. If I did my homework right, CircleCI kind of emerged during the rise of cloud DevOps in 2011.
Yep.
And you joined a couple years later, I think 2014.
That's right.
So setting aside AI for a minute, we'll get to that later. But what are the big changes that you've seen in software development since starting in 2014?
Yeah, well, I'll go back to 2011 because I think that's, CircleCI was of a moment. It was Rails monoliths being deployed to Heroku, right? Every startup was just like cookie cutter, not the same business, but the same approach, right? The stacks were all quite similar. I'm not saying everyone was using that, but it was very, very common. And in fact, I got to CircleCI let me finish that thought. There was a lot of trust being developed in cloud. People wanted to deploy to Heroku. The Rails community was very, you must test, Rails scaffold, whatever. I haven't used Rails in a really long time, but it was like, cool, here's your test suite. Like, you should probably start implementing tests. And so that forced a perspective that CI was good, that testing was good, that delivering quickly was good, and but not necessarily a bunch of infrastructure experience. And so saying, hey, we'll do that on your behalf, was kind of the promise of CircleCI at the time. And I always joke that, the company, I wasn't there at the beginning, as you said, had product market fit like the afternoon of launch sort of thing. Like, everyone was just like, absolutely, we need that. We're going to do that right away. Oh, thank goodness, because we didn't want to have to build this out ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was a great beginning. And then I joined in 2014. I actually in 2011 was building a Rails app. It wasn't deployed to Heroku, but close enough. And then we sort of went through some pivots and we started building mobile apps, and ended up deciding the tooling was terrible, built a mobile CI/CD platform, and basically joined CircleCI in 2014 with that offering. And that is a really good indicator of what was happening in 2014. From like everything was web first. We were just joking about jQuery. There was a lot of Rails and jQuery in 2011, and by 2014, everyone was building mobile apps, right? Like iOS, the App Store had been around longer, Android had been around, but that was when it was like the default. You started with mobile, and so that was a big transition. And one of the things that I always mention about that time is if you look at the early tooling around building iOS apps, the testing frameworks, the package managers, all of it's written in Ruby, because all of those developers came to iOS, right? They said, oh, no one's building like websites anymore. We got to build apps. And they showed up and they were like, what are you people doing? There's no testing. There's no package management. Like, it's a free for all over here.
Sounds like JavaScript, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, you see these transitions, like a lot of these,
right?
When it becomes sort of a locus, like when everyone is developing there, it gets a lot more attention, and people it's one of the things I love about learning multiple different languages, working in different ecosystems, is people bring experiences from elsewhere. They tend to be a little more insular, right? And then this whole crew shows up from Ruby and just goes, oh my goodness, like this is unacceptable, right? And we could probably build a package manager or a testing framework in Ruby way faster than we can build in Objective-C, because we're still learning that language. So there's this kind of weird like historical piece in there. So anyway, 2014 becomes very mobile.
Remind me, like, was there like I remember working at that time on a what's it called, Phone Gap? I don't know if you remember Phone Gap, where you would write basically a web app and put it in a wrapper that you could then sell. But Swift didn't exist then, right? Am I right?
That's right. Yeah. I can't remember when exactly it came out. Someone's going to fact check me on that. But I remember going to some developer conference where they were just starting to talk about it, an Apple developer conference. But I think I was already at CircleCI. So it's around that era. But it was a long time before it really became the dominant approach, right? Because people already had a language they were comfortable with. There was a long period where Swift apps were very bloated compared to Objective-C apps. Because I think there's some extra translation layers or something in there. And so it took a long time to really, I think, get like large foothold in the community. Again, someone's going to fact check me on that, but that's my memory. Like as I even building what we were building prior to CircleCI, we'd stopped building apps and we were building tooling for apps. So I was writing a lot of Python and whatever. I wasn't writing like, Objective-C or whatever anymore, but all of our customers were still building an Objective-C at that time. We've seen that transition though, for sure. And I mean, I remember, speaking of JavaScript frameworks, I remember something called Objective-J, which was like in the late 2000s, I think, like 09, something like that, which was, we're going to write JavaScript in Objective-C, which, with the hindsight of history, obviously was a terrible idea, because even Apple didn't want Objective-C, right? So like the idea that we would write more of it and make it like a transpiler or whatever for JavaScript was I mean, I tried it because that's what you do when there's new JavaScript frameworks. So I guess on the theme of transitions over that time, we'll just say there's been a new JavaScript framework every 6 months.
Hey, but that's calmed down now.
Yes. Well, I think some big players, there's bigger players, bigger support, right? When you think about like React, with entire companies behind them. Next, I'm not really a front end or JavaScript person for the most part, but I do see that slowdown. I do think, for me, as someone who doesn't spend a lot of time in there, React was a fundamental change in how to think about the front end that I think was really useful. Like, we're no longer just searching around for whatever state we might have left something in and hoping we can find it, but actually deciding what we want something to look like. And I think that the other big transition before we got to this era that we're in was containers, right? Docker. Like we had a containerized platform built on LXC because Docker didn't exist when CircleCI started, right? And so then suddenly everyone, like, that was really novel what we were doing, and then suddenly everyone was containerizing because it was a model to get to clear deployment. But then they got convinced that because they could put things in Docker containers, they should build hundreds of different services. They needed to coordinate those. And then we had this sort of like orchestration wars, like I think 2016, I'd say there were 10 orchestrators, and 2017 there was one. It was really, like, to me, it was really that fast. Kubernetes just said, I mean, Google put the weight behind it or whatever. And by 2017, I think every orchestrator was just a wrapper on Kubernetes. But that was probably the last. I must be missing something, but that's the really big shift, because we felt that as a company. We felt that, like, how we provided service to a Rails monolith versus how we provided service and capabilities to people building hundreds of microservices and building them inside of Docker containers, et cetera, was just very, very different. And so our goal was the same, but the approach that we had to take, we sort of re-architected our whole platform to make that work effectively. I mean, part of that was us scaling at the same time and reaching sort of limits of our initial architecture, but there was a huge amount that, you can tell I could talk about this all day long, because the product that we have to build is so influenced by how software developers work, that we really felt all those changes. And it was, I would say, I'm a big proponent of boring technology. I have all the battle scars to convince me that that's the right way to approach it. But at the same time, as a business, we have to be very far ahead of the curve and even be trying things, not just reading about them, to really understand how developers are using them so that we can build the right product for those developers. So we sit on this kind of scale or knife edge, or however you want to think of it, between trying to build things that are super reliable and stable, and like, let's use the thing that we've battle tested 1,000 times, and we have to try all the nutty things that every developer is going to try
that
this
your
week.
Customers are actually doing.
Right, because if we don't understand those, we're going to get blindsided and we're going to be too late with them. So I mean, that's what makes it fun to be in my job, honestly.
CircleCI was, like we talked about, a pretty early entrant in the space and had instant product market fit. It's been 11, soon to be 12 years.
I think they started working late 2011 and launched kind of early 2012 kind of time frame. So
Got it.
March, April, something like that. But yeah.
So like you said, at that time, people were they were hungry. This was like obviously a missing piece of software development. And so getting customers was, I imagine, quite easy. But now there's lots of competitors. So this is kind of not a technical question, but a like C-level question. How are you keeping relevant and competitive in a world where there are lots of other services now that kind of offer something similar?
Yeah. So I would say two things. One, I'll go pre-2020, it's really 2023, but we'll call it pre-2025. And then what we think about in 2025. So we actually launched into a world of competitors. Like we have slides that we've made in the past that show all the different CI/CD companies kind of coming in and out of this space. AWS has been our competitor alone 3 times with 3 totally different offerings. And so we've seen this, I think, when it was like cruise control is like late 90s, 2000s, somewhere in there. You had, I'm trying to think of other names, but there were a ton, and they've come and gone in our time. I'm great friends now with one of the founders of CI, who were like, that was our cohort, right? It was sort of CircleCI and CI at the same time, but with very different approaches, building very similar things. But they were approaching, this from an open source perspective, right? And we were sort of going after the commercial offering. And what's interesting about that is the products probably look and feel very similar, but you could see, like, when you're really in it, you can see distinct approaches to different capabilities that we would focus on and they would focus on, sort of thing. And I think that's one key element. Like, we've always been in a pool of a lot of competitors, and knowing who you are and what you're shooting for and which customer you're going after and what pain they feel every day when they wake up, I think is what has allowed us to stay, relevant and competitive and differentiated, right? Like, trying to think of a good example. Maybe I think Simon Sinek is really good at describing this kind of thing, like really understanding, what you're solving and who you're solving for, or why you're solving it, I guess, is like start with why terminology. And when you have a connection with that group, then you're always going to be in with that group, kind of thing. And I mean, we think of our group as like the people who really care about software delivery, meaning I get up every day and like I want to be great at this. There's a lot of good enough. Before I joined CircleCI, before we started building a CI platform, we were building on Jenkins. Jenkins has like changed the world in terms of people being able to do this, but I don't get a ton of like love anymore from people who are using it. They're like, we don't know how to get off of it. Like we're kind of stuck with it. But the world has moved on, right? So there's a lot of, there's a lot of transition. We wake up every morning and just think about the customer that we care about, the person that's trying to be really, really amazing at software delivery. Now, all that said, everything is changing right now. I don't even know if CI is the thing in another year, right? Like people want to deliver high quality software. They want to move really quickly, right? I mean, y'all are very into developer experience and productivity, et cetera, right? Like that's what really matters. And we've recently accelerated one of the steps, right? We can generate code faster, but we haven't figured out all the rest of the pieces. And so now I think what matters most to me is not like, what are any of my competitors doing, but what is happening in this space? How is software delivery going to evolve? What would amazing software delivery look like, even though not all my customers can see it? And how can we create that opportunity for them and that experience? And then we have all the room in the world to be relevant. Like I think the whole slate has kind of been tossed up in the air. And that's exciting for me. Like I'm a, entrepreneur by sort of background and history and whatever. And so I think there's a huge amount of opportunity. And so what's most important to us now is not, what is one other person doing in sort of CI or whatever, because it's like, how is the whole software delivery lifecycle changing? And how can we make that amazing for people? We have always been concerned with people delivering high quality software to their customers quickly, right? Speed wins in the marketplace. The faster you move, the more likely you are to differentiate from your competitors as our customer. And the way that you do that now is changing so fundamentally that I don't even know who our competitors are, if I'm totally honest, right? Like I know lots of people that build stuff like we build, but I don't know who's headed where we're headed.
Yeah. You tell me when you find out.
We'll see.
all the same kind of uncertainty in any dev tooling is, I imagine, going through this right now.
But it's exciting. I mean, I just speaking of the tenure, like when we first, I joined CircleCI with two other folks because we were building this mobile platform, and one of my colleagues from that is the CEO of CircleCI and has been for basically the whole time. When we joined, fundraising was like, no one's going to spend money on developer tools, right? I mean, look at where we are now. So I at least feel, verified or validated or whatever the right word is as a result of that experience. So it's delightful to be a part of such a rapidly moving, rapidly growing ecosystem.
So in the context of this really like customer focus, customer obsession that you've had as part of your DNA, how does that translate into, very boring things like setting goals and choosing priorities? And who's involved in that? And how do you manage conflicts in those, and et cetera?
I'd say setting goals isn't really boring right now either.
Well, that's probably fair.
Yeah. I mean, again, we had a very long stretch of sort of like a little bit bigger. This year is the same as last year, but we'll have more customers and bigger customers. We were almost not entirely. I mean, we were expanding and adding capabilities and whatever, but a lot of that was driven by a natural shift in the market as organizations realized, hey, you know what, there might be something to this continuous delivery, and like maybe we could be better at software development, et cetera, et cetera. And so we could have a much more calm goal setting, planning cycle. And now we're really are back to more of a, not everywhere, but certainly in the parts of where we're trying to invest in the shifting market, like more of a 0 to 1. This is about discovery, about putting things in front of customers and seeing how they react and whether that helps them, et cetera, et cetera. And so I would say that is a good stress on an organization in the sense that it forces you to be better at certain things. If it's really clearly linear, and your projections are pretty straightforward, that can mask lack of understanding or like decision-making drifting upwards because decisions don't have to get made that often, et cetera. But to really be responsive, it requires a much better understanding of goals and objectives down at a team level. And so, I think the thing that I haven't really gotten into the people, but assume all the normal cast of characters are involved. I mean, we have designers and product people and engineers and whatever. And a lot of time now, I spend a lot of time now trying to convey a picture, a fuzzy, but some picture of where we think the future might be, where the future is like 14 days from now. And how we would be well positioned to end up there, right? So that teams can make better decisions at a localized level. And I mentioned earlier sort of being back in the tech and just trying to understand where a lot of that is me, just the way my brain works, like puzzling with the things and saying, okay, if this works like this and this works like this, what's missing to make this great? And how could we play a role in that? And then, hey, everybody, here's how would we, if this were the thing, what would we go about doing? And then what is your team like? What role could you play in this? And what role could you play in this? And then I need folks to have a better understanding of that, again, because as the market is shifting faster, I'm trying to figure out a way to do this as a metaphor. I'm making hand signals. It's not going to show up if you're listening to just audio, but if the market is taking bigger turns, right, and you are going in a straight line for too long, the miss is much bigger, right? And so I'd say that's the biggest change right now, the biggest change in sort of being in this market. And I imagine this is true for any organization, but certainly developer tools, where we're watching the whole thing just be turned on its head. Not just paying close attention, but paying enough attention to make bets about how things might play out. And then this wasn't really in your question, but I've been thinking about this a lot, so I'll share it. From a technical perspective, it's always been true that architecture decisions tend to happen on a longer time frame, or be impactful on a longer time frame, than product decisions. The architecture decisions are still on the same kind of time frame, but the product decisions are getting shorter and shorter, right? So a big part of what I do in this process is try to help people think about the approach, the design, the whatever, that is not overly expensive and generalized and all that, but allows for what we think are sort of the set of possibilities that are likely, because we're probably wrong about our first attempt, right? Some news is going to come out on Monday morning and we'll be like, oh, well, that part of the market just vanished, right? Let's go over here. And if you're like, but I was building the entire architecture to support this page, on the website or whatever, you're going to be really, really sad. And so it's a little bit of pushing down some understanding and then bringing up some understanding of how to design, I guess, for fuzzier futures, which I think, I guess I'll call it a skill. And that skill goes away or gets diminished as you have a very clear projection of where you're going.
Let me ask, have you managed to sign an annual contract with any AI provider?
We have an interesting take that I think it might be developer tools oriented as well, in that in a lot of places we like to standardize. This is the basic toolkit that everyone uses. You show up as a developer, you know what you're doing, et cetera. And it doesn't mean we're great at it everywhere. And we have all of our standard hiccups in developer productivity. But when it comes to AI tooling, at least for developers, we want our developers to try all of them, right? We want them to experience the strengths and weaknesses of everything that's happening in the ecosystem, so they can see the gaps. If I were just running this is a very hard job, but if I were running an engineering organization at a bank, I would want my developers to be as productive as possible. And we would take out a small team of trusted engineers and pick the tool. And we would go all in on that tool, until obviously it flamed out and went out of business or whatever. But we would try to make it so that everyone had a standard approach. But because struggling with the tool, right? And that standard helps because everyone can help each other. And, oh, look, I learned this cool trick and whatever. But struggling with the tool is actually the value often for us, right? Because we're so early, having our engineers say, I tried this and it's garbage. And we're like, great, tell me more. What could we do to make it not the case? How could we help developers who are using that tool? What do we think about this tool? Really building that knowledge and understanding. So we have a little bit of sprawl in a way that's, not the way we think about a lot of tooling, but because so much is changing, having all that perspective and having people say, oh, I tried this and I love it. And this is what I love about it. Like, this is a really cool feature, or this is a novel capability. All of that is really interesting to us. So we have kind of a potpourri, if you will, of developer tools internally. Less so when our like standard, everyone in the company has access to, to Claude to ask questions and do some work and whatever. But when it comes to developer tools, we're a little bit, it feels chaotic, but it's intentional.
I asked about the annual contract sort of in jest, but like I think that approach is where a lot of companies should be right now, especially in the dev tooling space. But even beyond the dev tooling space, like one tool may be more, especially once you look outside of engineering, which is why I think we're going to get a lot of perhaps more leverage than out of code AI assisted code generation. Yeah, because like you said, AI assisted code generation just if you have any bottleneck downstream, then you've just made it worse by making there be more code.
Yeah, I feel like I need a footnote for my customers that are listening. We absolutely do look at the models that we use and I think that's really interesting because initially when everyone was launching into this space, it was like the IDE or the interface and the model were tightly coupled. I'm giving you a plugin to VS Code, or I've got a fork of VS Code, or I wrote an entirely new IDE, which was all a gateway to the model. And I think now people have realized you can decouple those things, and I can go back to using Vim if I want to, and I can talk to whatever model. And so I think the interfaces and the models have become a little bit independent in a way that it's just like as someone who pays attention to the market and who pays for what and whatever has become really interesting to me. So we actually use a lot of different tools and then point them at our like corporate approved model sort of thing. But I think that's really telling in terms of what this market is becoming, right? Like the IDE, honestly, like if you move into agents, and all you're doing is controlling multiple agents off doing their own thing, which I love to think about, but I'm not capable of doing. An IDE is a really bizarre interface to try to do that from, right? So like I think we're going to start to see those things separate a little bit, and we'll care a lot more about prompts and context and models than we will about, we've always let our developers use whatever IDE they want because they have keystrokes memorized, and it's just not worth worrying about. Yeah.
I think the tooling stuff is interesting because I also talk to a lot of people in the industry who are like they're still on Copilot. Like that still is their engagement with the space, and it's limited to Copilot. And they haven't explored things like Claude Code or these things that are much more agentic and much more independent. So I think there's also a risk of like vendor lock-in in that regard. Copilot was a great thing to buy in 2023, but maybe not in 2024, and maybe extra not in 2025. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it does go back to your point about the annual contract, like just knowing what flexibility you want to have in your choices, right? I mean, just the evolution of the models is really interesting to me. And I wonder if we should be insulating from that a little bit. Like, yes, they're going to get better over time, but do I want to switch every other week when someone else comes out with something? Like, how I prompt, how I interact with it, they're all tuned slightly differently. And am I like relearning all this tooling every other week because some benchmark says that this model is better, right? So, I feel like that hopefully stabilizes a little bit so we can focus on, doing the work at some point. Yeah.
Yeah. What sort of things are the board and your CEO holding you accountable for in this wonderful era that we're in today?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because I can't figure out if anything has changed. Like if I think about it at a super high level, right? What does it mean to be successful as a CTO? One, everyone does the job totally differently. So it's like a really weird question to ask about. But on another level, you're an executive, right? So like your first team's other exec is comprised of other executives in the organization. And I try to have this conversation with people regularly. Like, I am not the leader of tech. I mean, I am the leader of technology, but like, I'm not the person who does the tech things, right? I am a member of a team who happens to have more depth likely in technology than most of the other people sitting around the table, but I'm trying to solve the company's problems, right? And some days the company's problems have nothing to do with technology, right? Like, and certainly in 2025, like aside from AI in 2025, although it's AI adjacent, you have this whole sort of founder-led marketing or whatever we're calling, like content marketing. And just like I've always been someone who's out with customers, trying to understand their problems, trying to help them understand how we think about them, how they can be better. Putting out thoughts in the market. I'm going to not say thought leadership, but like just putting out thoughts and trying to engage in the conversation about where this is all going. Right. I come at that because I have a technology background and our customers are very technical, but I'm not doing that and writing code at the same time, right? Like, well, maybe my agent's writing code on my behalf. But so I think, a huge part of what one does as a CTO or as an exec is whatever would be most impactful to the business today. And I think it's really easy to say. But everyone, doesn't matter what level you operate, everyone is guilty of falling back into their comfort zone, right? So if you're very technical, you think technology is kind of the solution to every problem, which I still do. And so how am I measured? I mean, I'm measured on the success of the business, right? So what I'm held accountable to is making the best use of the funds that we have to create the largest impact, right? And I think at lower levels, and in some cases at executive level, but more at lower levels, it depends on the organization, people get sucked into turning that into, like non-monetary terms, like headcount and tech debt and whatever. And I say this all the time. I run this workshop at a couple different conferences, and one of the things I always talk about is turning everything into the common denominator of business discussion, which is currency, right? I'll say dollars because we're both in the US, but euro, pound, doesn't matter, right? Whatever your business operates in, like you should be able to turn everything that you do into some dollar impact. And as you get higher up, you're going to have bigger error bars on what you think the impact is going to be. And that's okay, right? Like it's part of the life of an executive. There's a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of guesswork. There's a lot of going with your gut, there's all of that. But then, to the point of being in the same job 11 years, you get paid on or held accountable for, whatever, however you want to think about it, the statistical outcomes, right? If you make more bad decisions than good decisions, then you're going to have a problem. But if you're generally driving the business up and to the right, and every once in a while you make a bad decision or a decision that works out poorly, because you can make a great decision and still have a terrible outcome, right? Like that's the reality of complex decisions in complex environments, right? So over time, do you, well, this is, I guess, about me, but like this, I think this should be everyone's question. Like, do you drive good returns on the investment of dollars that you have the opportunity to spend, right? Like we generate money, we generate cash and then we spend cash and we try to spend that cash to generate even more cash, right? And like at the end of the day, I understand what tech debt is and how it's impacting my team. I understand what the product opportunities are, but I have to decide or help others decide. We're actually not going to do this thing right now that sounds like a great idea because we can do this other thing and we're going to spend the same amount of money and get a much bigger return on it. So that's what we're going to go do, right? And I think if you can't sort of make that conversion, you struggle at an executive level.
Yeah. I feel like one, and I'm curious if this has been your experience, but one thing that seems very different at the leadership level is kind of what you said, like this new focus on business outcomes. We always should have been focused on business outcomes, but it feels like there was a period around the time that CircleCI came on the scene until around 2021, 2022, where the job was hire, grow, retain. And like money was easy to come by. And there wasn't, in my experience, there wasn't always necessarily a focus on the business outcomes. There was focus on like, how much are we doing and how quickly are we doing it?
Yeah, I think that varies organization to organization. I think what's different is not so much business outcomes, yes or no, but rather the investment model that you're operating under and the market that you're operating in, right? So when everyone has unfettered access to capital, right? If we're totally honest about ZIRP and whatever, then your competition is investing ahead of return in order to generate maximum growth, right? And so business outcomes in those markets are often measured in revenue growth, right? Purely on revenue growth. And so as an executive, as again, to the question of the board and whatever, as an organization, you're being held to executing at a pace that is achievable, right? Again, when unfettered access to capital, and delivering returns on that in a way that will generate more unfettered access to capital. Like that, it's even with hindsight, I wouldn't say that that approach is flawed. I'd say it is time bound, right? And so ultimately, like the very rapid, abrupt, however you want to describe it, transition from ZIRP to post ZIRP, whatever era we entered, which actually became just a tale of two economies, AI or not, right? That transition is like the end of a game of musical chairs. And depending on where you are in your growth and how much money you've just dropped in the bank, et cetera, you could end up in a spectrum of states from like, cool, we don't need to hire anymore. We got $200 million in the bank. We'll tighten things up. We'll be a little more productive and we're good to go for another 3 years, right? To, we were just about to raise. We're running this thing on fumes and we have no idea how we're going to make payroll next week, right? And so somewhere in the middle is probably the right fit. And I think one of the lessons that a lot of founders or execs or whoever was doing capital raises learned was about the value of pricing and fundraising, right? Like if you were sort of priced to absolute perfection of the market and then the wheels fell off the market, you see a lot of down rounds, a lot of disappointing numbers, et cetera, because those weren't realistic. I mean, public markets move up and down every day and everyone thinks that's normal, right? So I think there's plenty of opportunity in that type of market for organizations with zero sense of responsibility or like accountability or good use of funds or whatever to continue to operate, but they're hard to tell apart from the ones that are just growing really successfully because they're putting the money to work, right? And so and then the end, right? And how companies ended up at the end of that, a lot of it has to do with just the timing of how investment cycles work. Like as an individual organization, you're going out, 18 months, 24 months to raise again. And you could have been 3 weeks after raise or 3 weeks from raise. And how you ended up at the end of that was, it was a very different outcome. And I haven't really thought about it, but I don't know what you would do differently, right? Like it's kind of the way the VC market works.
Yeah. I just always think it's interesting to compare and contrast to, like, I remember weeks where the weekly management meeting was about how your hiring was going. And that was all we talked about. We didn't talk about what we were getting done. We just talked about, did we have enough headcount?
Yeah. I think that's a real risk, right? Like given what you do, I know you know this, but like there's not a direct linear correlation between the heads that you've added to your spreadsheet. It's like, I don't know how we talk about headcount, like the people, hopefully we're hiring whole people, right? And the outcome, the output, let alone the outcome, right? But there is a reasonable relationship. Like if you have a larger team, at some point you should be able to make that team more productive. Now, I think many organizations probably wish they had done the work they're being forced to do now before they went into those growth curves, right? Because if everyone talks now, I keep hearing this sentiment that AI is an amplifier, right? And as you try to accelerate, you can tell whether your processes are good or bad because you either accelerate or you fall on your face. The same could be said for hiring, right? Like if you have broken processes and poorly understood software and it's very complex and no one knows how to work on it, a bunch more people trying to figure out how to make progress is not going to help. But if you're super dialed, right, and you have a very simple system that's easy to understand, it's well partitioned, fast flow of change, to quote, team topologies folks, a good organizational structure, then you can add a lot more people successfully and grow more successfully, right? And so we're kind of testing the same thing. I hadn't thought about this until right now. We're kind of testing the same thing and stressing the same things. The difference is there won't be as much like heartburn at the end if it goes wrong. You know what I mean? Like it's a lot different to like stop shipping tokens to a LLM than it is to have to turn around and cut a bunch of jobs.
I think that comparison is really apt. And it's very, very interesting because I've been kind of in the developer productivity adjacent space for years now, seeing companies decide to do the things that they should have been doing all along, or recognizing that the things that they were slowing down their humans are also slowing down their AI. And they could have had more human productivity at any point if they had just invested in like high quality SDLC.
Yeah, I mean, agree. We see this a lot. We hear this discussion about amplification. I'm fine with it because we help people be great at this. So, call me anytime. I will help you. I will help you accelerate. And I think the less generous version of my question has always been, how is it that we have more empathy for these machines that are struggling than we did for the humans? But just in talking about how these are sort of the same thing, I think the time scale is very different, right? Like watching AI struggle is like watching your human team struggle on time-lapse camera. Like it took 10 years for all of that. And at that slower speed, you don't quite notice it. But when you try to, acutely sort of rocket up the curve, it becomes really obvious. And therefore that applies time pressure. And speaking as an executive, throwing shade on executives, like, our attention span is super short, right? So to kind of see that over a long curve and say, oh yeah, this is the thing that's really hurting us, is harder than seeing it in weeks, right? And yeah, I also wonder if people, I don't know, I'm very much going out on a limb here, but I'm trying it. If people get so accustomed to headcount, right, the cost of the people in their organization, again, maybe it's just a timescale thing. Like I hire and I hire and I hire and it sort of ratchets up. But one day I go sign this, annual contract with an AI provider and I'm like, I need to demonstrate ROI on this in 3 months because like we need to be blowing the doors off by the end of the year kind of thing. And, I think I keep hearing that 2026 or maybe late 25, but let's call it 2026 at this point, is sort of like the period of reckoning where everyone's saying, cool, we spent all this money on these tools on promise. Has it worked out? What have we gotten? And I mean, speaking of being a beneficiary, like I think the developer metrics, developer productivity companies are like, cool, we can help you with that. Like it's about time you measured what was happening in your organization and we're here for it, And so I think, yeah, it's on the one hand, joking about the empathy, it's a bit unfortunate that we didn't have this insight earlier, but better late than never, like we'll build better organizations. We'll hold ourselves accountable and we'll focus on the things that really matter.
Do you think there's a risk? And again, probably not in the developer tooling space because we've lived and breathed this for a long time. But do you think there's a risk that some companies are just not going to be able to be competitive anymore because they don't have those fundamentals in place?
Yeah. I mean, short answer, yes. I believe we've seen, even in the pre-Gen AI era, organizations with great software delivery outpace organizations without. And I've been saying probably my entire time at CircleCI, like software is eating the world. Every company is a software company at this point. An example I used to use for new hires a few years ago was the president or CEO of Volkswagen Group getting fired because of software delays. Like it's a car company. I own a Volkswagen product and I refer to it as a computer with wheels at this point, right? Like I was on a road trip and it stopped working, and it was just like, no, thank you, not working today. Like there's nothing you can do, right? It's just, reboot, didn't work. I had a lot of choice words for the shop when I found out how they did their observability on the car. But yeah, I think it's like that has been true already. And I think this additional acceleration for the haves versus the have-nots, like this acceleration is going to spread the field even more. And so, if you were looking like the slow gazelle at the back of the pack before this, you're in trouble. The wolves they're probably just gonna run right past you, honestly, and move on to the next one. You won't even see them worth their time. But I do think it will spread the field even more because, you've got this at the front, people accelerating so much more, and at the back, people almost slowing down because they're just like lost and confused, trying to figure out how to use the tooling.
You bring up cars being computers on wheels, and it reminds me of the other day I was backing my car into my driveway, and I have the backup camera, and it beeps at me if I get too close to anything and all that. My kid was with me. He's 12. My kid was with me, and I was like, do you know I had to learn how to do this without a camera? And he was like, how? Like, how is this possible? And so I am now committed to like covering up the camera in his whatever car he is driving as he's learning, so he can learn to back up the old way. But bringing that back to AI, you can probably see where I'm going. Like, what is that? Like, I don't know how to back up a car without my backup camera.
Yeah. Well, I think we see bits of it already in I don't want to say junior, but inexperienced developers who are maybe transitioning to software development, and sort of using these tools as a crutch. Now, did that already exist with copy and paste from Stack Overflow? Probably, but you can copy and paste it at a shocking rate with code generation, and so there's a really interesting question. I don't know even what my perspective of the answer is about sort of fundamentals and core understanding. I saw a paper really recently, which I can't quote because I can't remember where I found it. I'm going to try to dig it up, illustrating that more senior developers had higher acceptance rates on their work generated by LLMs, because they knew more about how to think about, break down, structure the request, structure the unit of work, et cetera, in a way that an experienced software developer knows how to do. It's the same reason they're productive when they build on their own. They know how to break it down into pieces and build the pieces, test the pieces. And so they're just getting better output, right? And so at the moment, if you're building, the cool prototype, it doesn't really matter. But if you're building systems, I want to say real, proper, I don't know what the right word is, but if you're building systems to scale, right, to evolve, then you're going to have to understand how they work today. Now, like Galaxy Brain far out, I have no idea if we still write code, right? Like at some point, we are asking a computer to generate a human abstraction over instructions for a computer, right? So like there's some interplay that is about sort of human transition and metaphor and clinging to metaphors, right? That maybe ends up being less valuable over time, but I think it'll take us a while to get there. So I think, again, I'm not 100% certain. I do think it's easy to just accept the changes and not really know what the changes are doing. But it's not long before your changes are wrong. And then the question is, and not like massively wrong, but just wrong enough to be broken, right? And if you've been accepting for 3 hours, click, 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 and then you have to figure out what in all of that broke. I hope you committed between each change. And I hope you know how to use git bisect. Like it's so funny to me because git bisect is like a fantastic tool that almost no one knows how to use properly. But maybe those will be the things that come back. Like maybe the craft changes but you still need to understand the pieces of it. I'm not really sure. Like metaphorically, I remember having a discussion with someone about a database system that we were running on top of AWS or something like that. And I said, well, if you think about it, this has to happen, and therefore this has to get loaded from disk, and that would be when this slows down. And they said, are there disks in the cloud? And I was like, I don't know what to say at this point. Like, yes, you clicked a button online and got a computer, but it's a computer, right? Like at the end of the day, like, sure, it's not platters. There's SSDs, but they still have slower load times than, CPU cache or whatever. Like, there's only so many ways to build this stuff, right? And so having like when you push cloud computing, right? We're a big AWS customer. We push the bounds of AWS, right? Like we do things where we hit the physical limits of what it's capable of doing. And therefore we have to understand those things and optimize for them, right? And I think if you're building systems at that level of scale and complexity, you will need to know a little bit about what your code does. Whether or not even if it's all written by a machine into machine code, again, knowing the physics, like actual fundamental limits of the universe and how it operates, and therefore what you can achieve is important, right? And so I think, yeah, it's a super interesting question. How do I tape over the backup camera so that people, I heard someone give a talk where they said that, they talked about an organization that had like a 3 or 6 month no AI. Like when you join, you have to work without AI long enough to understand how our systems function, so you don't just start dumping stuff in, because we need you to have that context. But you could think about that in the context of a new developer, right? Like what, and then how long is that information and knowledge going to be valuable? I don't really know. I'm like a fundamentally curious person, so I like to understand how things work. And so I'm not that interested in what's the shortcut.
I would also, I love code archaeology, figuring out like, how does this work? How did this happen? And AI is really helpful for that, like for just asking questions about your code or getting it to write code that answers questions about your code. And so I see both sides of that. Like you can, if you don't give me that for the first 3 months or 6 months, in some ways you're holding me back. And in other ways, you're ensuring that like engineers can still engineer.
Yeah. I mean, I was doing some work on like fun side, whatever, on an open source thing recently. And I was like reading all the code. And I was like, what am I doing? I just started asking Claude. I'm like, Claude has access to this. Hey, how does this work? What does this thing do? How does this work? And it was fantastic. It was, and then I said, what am I doing? It keeps giving me code samples. So I switched to Claude Code and I said, hey, can you just do this for me? And it went really badly. Maybe I'm one of those junior engineers that can't get a good PR, but the explanations of why it was doing what it was doing was enough to guide me on the right path, right? It was a complex piece of code and whatever. But yeah, way easier than like, I wish there was documentation out there for this. I think there's a lot of things that fundamentally change. And yes, building understanding, super helpful. But if you're sort of shortcutting and always looking at keep using the backup camera, and to be clear, in California, they tape over the backup camera. Oh, wait, no, they don't. But if you look at it, you automatically fail your test. So you should definitely, the best thing to do is to put a piece of paper over it so you can't. Yeah, I think having fundamentals is a better way to deliver great software with the advanced tooling, right? Like know how to do the basics so that you can apply the acceleration of the tooling. Still feels right to me right now.
It has been so great to talk to you about this. And I love like this exchange of ideas and metaphors and all of that we've had during this call. And it's really interesting too, to talk to another leader in this dev tool space, because I think it is bearing a lot of the brunt of whatever is happening right now. So just really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us. And I hope to stay in touch, because it sounds like some neat things are happening and possibly very relevant to my world.
Yeah, sounds amazing. Thanks so much for having me. It's been great.
Absolutely. And that's the show. Engineering Unblocked is brought to you by Swarmia, the engineering intelligence platform that's trusted by some of the best software companies in the world. See you next time.